Hey everybody, and welcome to another review, and this time we're talking about Iron Man number 278 to 291, which is the first 14 issues of Len Kaminski's run on Iron Man. Now, it's kind of debatable as to whether we'll be talking about the first 14 or just the first 12, because issues 78 and 79 are parts 6 and 12 or 6 and 13 of Operation Galactic Storm, which is a big Marvel event from the 90s. Basically, it's the whole Avengers team, and it goes through all their books, and there's just 2 months of space where all the books tied into that. You can go out and buy that in a couple different ways, but it ultimately doesn't really mean much. It's not the greatest event, it's just okay, and I'm sure it will constantly be in print. So really, we're touching from 280 to 291, and to get that stuff, you can either find it in issues, or you can get the Iron Man War Machine trade, because this is the introduction to War Machine. War Machine was not a thing before this, not even the armor. There isn't even like a hint of a more powerful suit of armor called the War Machine before this. And it's interesting because thinking about Iron Man just peripherally, if someone who hasn't read it, you would think Iron Man and War Machine would be a duo that goes back for a little while. But no, they don't. And it actually makes perfect sense when you think about it, that he's a 90s creation, because look at him. Look at his armor, and look at his name. He's so 90s. He's absolutely 90s. And to get straight into it, that's actually the biggest issue with this book, is that it's so absurdly 90s, to the point where there's references to like hammer time, and every character has to curse. And I don't mean like just flat out say a word that you wouldn't be able to publish in a normal comic, but everyone's got like a censored out line at least once per issue. There's a whole bunch of like 90s cliches in that way. There's guys running around in samurai armor, and absurdly giant shoulder pads, and some of the art being kind of weirdly techno, although it fits better here than it does anywhere else. And so the 90s cliches are the hardest thing to get through. You go from John Byrne's run, which has got this very classic Jack Kirby, Stan Lee kind of feel to it, and then immediately, one issue afterwards, you just jump into this absolute, completely built in the nature of the 90s piece. And it could be kind of jarring in that way if you're reading everything from Iron Man in sequence. However, this is really good. This is the best Iron Man has been since 208 at the end of Dennis O'Neil's run. This is really hard to compare to the John Byrne stuff, because it's not that the John Byrne stuff was bad. It was just extremely light. It was just kind of fun stories. It was kind of a techno fantasy. There wasn't a lot of ideas going on there. There wasn't a lot of interesting character and plot developments. It was just kind of okay. And then you go back to Mighlani and Layton's second run with Armor Wars, and then the oversized red and gold armor, and that stuff's just awful, and Tony's completely irredeemable by that point. And then you get here, and you're finally back to this completely character-driven narrative. You're completely back to doing a story about Tony Stark's personality flaws and his growth and his look for his purpose and his need for solutions. You go back to some of his backstory with his dad. You introduce a bit of tension between Rhodey and Iron Man, which again, the Rhodey stuff by the end of it, where he gets his own series and just kind of walks away from Tony, is still absurdly 90s. It's good for the character stuff, but to just spin off a character from your main book and have him be the dark, broody badass with armor and millions of guns, really, really 90s. But yeah, other than that, it's back to being about the characters. It's back to being about the character being pushed forward as opposed to writer leaving a stamp. Because that was the best thing about the first Michelini written and the Dennis O'Neil run of, you had the span of nearly 100 issues, everything from 115 to 208, that was just about getting Tony from point A to point B. It was about pushing that character forward, and the fact that Michelini and Layton were writing it, or the fact that Dennis O'Neil was writing it, didn't have anything to do with it. You go to the Michelini Layton stuff, you go to the John Byrne stuff, the second Michelini Layton stuff, and it's back to let's rewrite the status quo a little bit and do what I want to do with it, and make sure people understand that I'm the person that wrote this kind of thing, and not in a bad way. That's fine for certain books, but with a character like Iron Man, particularly a character in that Marvel tradition of these sorts of characters demand definitive endings at a point. It's better to be more about the progress than about what individual writers can bring to it outside of how much further they can push Tony. Because Tony's almost a living entity at this point, where he's naturally inclined to go in certain directions, and you should just let him go there. And the moment you don't, and you try to force him back, it becomes really jarring, and you get that with the second Michelini Layton run, especially with Armor Wars. So you're to this story, and it's a really interesting piece about legacies. It's a really interesting piece about Tony's self-destructive nature causing collateral damage. There's a great sequence of issues where because at this point Tony's nervous system is still shot, and so he's trying to figure out what his last couple acts in life are going to be. He's not looking for a solution anymore, at least to everyone else's knowledge, and he's just trying to get his will ready and try to find a successor, and trying to have everything prepared for when he eventually dies. And in doing so, he makes Rhodey head of Stark Enterprises, and he gives him the War Machine armor. And then Tony dies. But he doesn't really die. What happens is Tony asks his Dr. Abe Zimmer and one of the people that helped him put the chip in, that were introduced back in the second Michelini Layton run. Well, actually, Zimmer was introduced way back in the first Michelini Layton run. And they're the only ones that know this, but Tony's put in suspended animation. And while there, they look at the virus that's infecting his nervous system, and they retool it to be something that creates nervous systems instead of destroys them, and they have to teach it basic human motor function. And so they're just able to rewrite the chip and bring Tony back. And he can't move yet. He still has to relearn how his body works, but he's back at that point. But before you get to Tony waking up again, and when he's in suspended animation, there's enough leeway to where his mind is still active. And since he can't open his eyes, since he can't wake up, since he can't move, he's just dreaming, and he's refinding old memories. And in those memories, you learn about Tony's dad. And when you meet Tony's dad, you get this narration from Tony where he says that I thought my dad was this really great guy, but it turns out I just kind of repressed all the bad stuff because of all the success I've had, because of all the games I like playing in the world. And you get a very clear sense of how much Tony's like Obadiah Stane, because it's always about the challenge. It's always about the next game. It's always about conquering a field. And the reason he became Iron Man and became a CEO of a corporation is because that's the only point you can get to where things aren't too easy, and it's actually going the exact opposite direction of it. They're too hard, and Tony's like, that's the only way Tony can live. And you find out that he gets a lot of that from his dad, and his dad was actually the original alcoholic. His dad was the one that was wrecking things and hurting people because of alcohol, and that's where Tony gets it from, and that it is carried through the family legacy. And part of it's also that his dad forced into him a very certain mindset. He keeps saying that Tony needs to be a man of iron. He keeps saying that Stark men are made of iron. And the metaphor is actually kind of lost when you think about the fact that iron's actually a really soft metal. But then he gets to another line where he says, gold is soft and silver is brittle. Stark men need to be made of iron. And it's interesting how that feeds into Tony's making the Iron Man suit, calling it Iron Man, and then choosing the colors for it. Because red's always the anger color. Red's always the color of rage. Red's always that color of frustration. And that's Tony perfectly. And then you get the gold. And the gold is often the softness. Gold is the cowardice. And then when he loses that, he gets the silver. And the silver has him as a much colder, a much more collected person, much more calm person in the Dennis O'Neil stuff, and then he loses it in the second Michelini Run because because the foundation he's built his new personality on, however terrible Armor Wars was, the foundation of how he's built himself is completely brittle and it falls apart, and he goes back to the gold, and he goes back to kind of the softness, and that color symbolism playing back into his history with his dad is legitimately well done. It's really interesting. You never get a conclusion to it, though, at least not in these first 14 issues. You have the introduction of this shadowy organization, literally just people, businessmen in shadow, that want to take over Stark Enterprises. And they decide that what they're going to do is introduce Stark Enterprises to Tony's cousin. And Tony's cousin looks a little bit like him, except a bit more overweight. And they decide they're going to try and frame Rhodey for the death of Tony and all that stuff. That's all interesting. That's all propelling to another direction. It's still about the Stark legacy and about retooling that to serve your purposes. But in that big conspiracy plot, we sort of lose the whole Stark family stuff. And that's something, Tony's history with his family has always been something that we kind of dodge around. The next big time we see it is, as far as I can remember, the next big time we see it would be Matt Fraction stuff and then in the Karen Gillan stuff. But it's really interesting here. It's really well done. It's really subtle too. They don't feel the need to bash you over the head with like, look how similar Tony is to his dad. They just draw natural parallels and they let you figure it out. It's not like the overwrittenness that was happening in John Byrne's run, where you just get exposition on top of exposition on top of exposition on top of description to like bash into your mind this crystal clear picture. It's not that at all. The other big thing is that Rhodey becomes head of Stark Enterprises, and in doing so, he finally sees all the stress that Tony goes through, and he can't take it. He's not that person, and he has to be a little bit consequentialist. He has to be a little bit about the greater good as opposed to what's right, and we see that with the Living Laser. When the Living Laser wants to attack Tony for what he did at the beginning of John Byrne's run, he doesn't know that Tony's dead. So Rhodey says, well, you know, you were a clever scientist and all. How about I take you down to the lab and I give you a job? And he legitimately gives the Living Laser hope. And naturally, the Living Laser in his mind is thinking that I can just use this to make myself more powerful. But then he's constantly doubting that, saying things like, well, I'm rediscovering the love of pure curiosity and how much good I can do and how much I can learn and discover. And then Rhodey manipulates him to a place where he shoots the Living Laser into space light years away completely alone. And it really hurts Rhodey. It really pulls him in and makes him realize that I'm not just becoming Tony, I'm becoming full-fledged Obadiah Stane. And he doesn't say Stane, but that's kind of the draw you get there. And he's kind of falling apart. His girlfriend, Marcy Pearson, who was brought in from the second Michelini Layton run, said for a while there was supposed to be promoted to head of Stark Enterprises, but that fell through. And then when Rhodey gets it, she gives him an ultimatum between her and being head of Stark Enterprises, and Rhodey decides to just fire her. So he's got another strained relationship. You really get to see all of Tony's old experiences through Rhodey's eyes, and you even get Rhodey saying that he understands why Tony became an alcoholic, because that's probably the best way to do this job. And when he finds out Tony's alive, and he finds out that Tony lied to him the way he did, he just kind of breaks. Because you get so much set up in the beginning, so much for the first couple issues, where Tony's constantly thanking Rhodey for all the good he's done, and how much he's asked of him, and how much he's delivered. And then to have all that trust just kind of thrown out the window, even for good reasons, even for the fact that the only way he could have ensured that Tony wasn't going to be hurt while in suspended animation was to lie to everyone. It's kind of sad, and you really feel for him. And then at the end, Tony says that, well, the War Machine armor was created specifically for you. I was always intending to give it to you, and now you're Iron Man. And even if you leave Stark International, because Rhodey quits at the end when he finds out Tony's back, he says, at least keep the armor. And so he does, and that's where you spin out the War Machine ongoing series. And it's again, it's all really well told stuff. It's all really heartfelt. It's all very much about Tony's legacy and how far he's pushing people, and how crazy some of the things that you have to go through as head of Stark Enterprises. There's also some great moments here where you're in combat and you get like the on-screen Iron Man prompts, and you get to go through the commands, and it's almost like you're playing a video game. There's just a great vibe, a great techno thriller vibe to it, a great techno conspiracy thing. It feels very much built into the late 80s, early 90s Terminator style fears of the sentience of technology. There is no themes about AI here necessarily, but it is very much about people being afraid of machines, and how absolutely cybernetic everything's becoming, and it's really cool in that way. It's got a very clear technology-driven direction, and a kind of seeing 10 minutes into the future, as opposed to the other stuff we've gotten, where it's just next advancement after next advancement. This really feels like a technological book, and some of that's technobabble that actually doesn't make any sense. And if you really think about some of the things Tony says, some of the command prompts he uses, that's not how they work. But you're able to get past it just because they're giving you the atmosphere. And that's really what helps the actions. The action's really dynamic in that way. It really feels like a little bit of a programming war, and I think that's interesting. And another really cool thing about this, one final touch, is that Tony gets Stain International from Justin Hammer back. Because Stain International was previously Stark International, but then Stark International was taken over by Obadiah Stane, and then after Obadiah Stane died, there was a small group of people that were trying to keep his empire together, and eventually Justin Hammer was able to buy out Stain International. And after one final fight with Justin Hammer at the very beginning in this with Tony and the War Machine armor, Tony's able to buy it back, and Tony's able to kind of finally consolidate his legacy and consolidate who he is, and he's finally able to literally build himself back up from the ground up, with how his nervous system works, and how his company's functioned, and everything he's accomplished. He's finally able to push it forward, and then it's worth nothing to him because Rhodey leaves. And it's a really great character dynamic in that way. Like I said before, this is the best Iron Man has been since the Dennis O'Neil stuff. From 208 to 277. All that stuff ranges from really bad to just okay, and then here you're finally back to something that's really, really good, something that's legitimately fun to read, a really quick read, but also just packed with ideas and symbolism and really interesting confrontations between characters, because it's about the characters first as opposed to a really long, convoluted plot. So thanks everybody for listening. Let me know if you agree or disagree, what you think of the run, any other questions you might have. Make sure to follow me on Twitter, where I talk about anything and everything for 140 characters each. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.